Hi, my name is Doug Folsom, and I'd like to welcome you to Harassment and Discrimination Training. Today we're going to talk about harassment and discrimination in the workplace and what constitutes illegal harassment. As we go through the training, we will talk about different concepts, and when we get to the end of our training today, there will be a test, and so we'll need you to hang around all the way to the end and answer a few questions at the end of the test before your training is complete. So today we're going to discuss what is illegal harassment and how do I help make sure that I'm not contributing to harassing or discriminatory environments in the workplace. So to get started, let's just talk a little bit about what do some of these words mean. Of course, harassment, if we look at that, that means, you're being aggressive towards someone or pressuring someone in a way that can cause them to feel intimidated. And of course, that is something that can exist in a lot of different ways. Not all harassment is necessarily going to be illegal, but of course, in a good positive work environment, we want to make sure that we avoid harassment in ways that aren't helpful or aren't constructive. Also, we're talking about not just harassment, but discrimination. What is discrimination? Well, that is an unjust or prejudicial treatment of different categories of people. And this also is a very important thing to understand in the workplace and how this doesn't have a place in the workplace, especially when it comes to discriminating against people in specific categories. So then the question is, what is illegal harassment and discrimination? And basically, when we're talking about illegal harassment, number one, it's going to be behavior or activity that's occurring in the workplace, and that harassment or discrimination in the workplace is based on or directed at an individual or a group because of their membership in a protected class. So when we talk about this, most of the law that we're familiar with today is based in Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. In Title VII, it tells us it shall be an unlawful employment practice for an employer to discriminate against any individual with respect to his compensation, terms, conditions, or privileges of employment because of such individual's race, color, sex, or national origin. So here we get our first little flavor of what we're talking about when we talk about protected classes, where they mention race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. In fact, today, when we talk about protected classes, we can expand this a little bit more. Race, creed, and of course that can be similar to religion. A creed is a belief system. Color, and you'll notice that we talk about race and color. We list both of those because often we're talking about people's perceptions of others as well. National origin, or where someone's from, their gender, disability, age, pregnancy, or familial status, or in some situations, even genetics are protected under the law. Because when we're talking about this, we're not just talking about Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. There are a whole bunch of laws that exist in this country for the protection of people in various groups. Let me just highlight a few of those for you so you can understand. Even before the Civil Rights Act of 1964, we had an Equal Pay Act in 1963, which made it illegal to pay people different based on their gender. Also in 1967, we have what was called an Age Discrimination Act, where you couldn't discriminate against, or you can't discriminate against people based on age, and very specifically the age is 40, where that protection exists. In 1973, there was a Rehabilitation Act, which was kind of a precursor to the Americans with Disabilities Act. And in 1978, Title VII was amended to include pregnancy to the protected class, and pregnancy being a gender issue. But now we also are looking at familial status when we get to this amendment to Title VII. Also in 1990, we had the Americans with Disabilities Act. In 2008, the Americans with Disabilities Act was amended to make sure that we are giving people the protection intended by the law. And then also in 2008, there was a new law passed called GINA, or the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. And so under certain conditions, we can't discriminate against people in large part because of potential medical issues that could be tied to genetics that they have. So with this in mind, what is harassment? We talked about kind of a real brief definition of what harassment is, but within the context of Title VII and these other laws that we're talking about, harassment is any behavior or conduct which is based towards a person or a group because of their race, religion, their color, their national origin, gender, any disabilities that they have, age, if you're 40 or older, or pregnancy, which is pervasive and unwelcome, which is insulting, demeaning, threatening, ridiculing, derisive, or coercive, and results in a hostile, abusive, or intimidating work environment. There's a lot of words in there. We have to make sure we understand what all these words mean. So let's just take a few minutes and talk about what do these different words mean. Now, first of all, we notice in here it says that this conduct or behavior is pervasive and unwelcome. So for it to be illegal harassment, we're talking about it has to meet that criteria that's pervasive and unwelcome. And then it could be any one of these other words: insulting, demeaning, threatening, ridiculing, etc. So first of all, let's make sure we understand what the word pervasive means. Pervasive means that that something is existing in or spreading throughout an organization, for example. It's not isolated. It's something that's ongoing and has a deep reaching effect in an individual's behavior or throughout an organization. So pervasive is ongoing. In other words, if I make a slip and I say something really rude or demeaning towards somebody, but I only do it once, that's not pervasive because it's not ongoing. So I corrected my action, I never repeated it again. It's not pervasive. Pervasive actions are ongoing, they're consistently hostile. They could exist in the form of comments, jokes, innuendo, gestures, touching. It could be displaying of graphic material or jokes or printed material in the workplace. It could also be graphic communication, either verbally or electronically or in writing. And so when we talk about pervasive, we see how it can spread through an organization. An individual's behavior can be pervasive. If I am consistently telling a dirty joke all the time, or every day I tell a dirty joke, that's a pervasive behavior. In an organization, we may have a pervasive behavior when maybe individuals aren't doing that action in a pervasive manner, but everybody takes their turn doing it. So I tell a dirty joke today, tomorrow Jason tells a dirty joke, the day after that Brent tells a dirty joke, and so on and so forth. We all only say the dirty joke once, but in the organization we may consider this to be pervasive behavior because it's spreading out and ongoing within the organization. So that's pervasive. The other thing that it needs to be for it to be illegal harassment is it needs to be unwelcome. So when we talk about unwelcome, obviously, if you look up in the dictionary, it'll tell you it's the opposite of something being welcome, or the opposite of accepting with pleasure, the occurrence or presence of something. And so this gets to be a little tricky sometimes about what is unwelcome behavior. Obviously, if behavior is consistently rejected, you tell that dirty joke and someone tells you, hey, I really don't appreciate, those kind of stories, would you please not do that? That's a sign that we have unwelcome behavior, and it's rejected, and especially if it's consistently rejected. However, we could have circumstances where maybe the behavior was welcomed at first and then later on rejected. So if I've got someone who, for example, I'm dating somebody at work, and I invited this person out on a date, we started dating and everything was fine for a while, and then this person decided I'm a real jerk and they don't want anything to do with me, and so they cut off the relationship, okay? That interaction with that person was welcome at first, but then it was later rejected, okay? And the fact that it was later rejected is something that I have to respect. Also, it's very important to understand that consent, someone's willingness to go along and participate with you, maybe in the telling of dirty stories or jokes, or maybe it could be in a personal relationship, or maybe it could be engaging in inappropriate sexual behavior, with people in the workplace. That could be something that someone consents to doing for one reason or another, but in the end, they maybe aren't happy about it. It's not really welcome. So it's important to understand that consent does not mean that the behavior is welcome. So the boss, propositions a subordinate into an inappropriate sexual relationship. That subordinate may consent and go along because the boss has promised them something. They'll get a raise or something out of this relationship. Or maybe there's a threat that if they don't go along, they may lose their job or suffer some other adverse employment consequences. So they consent to the behavior. So as you can see, we can consent without it actually being something that's welcome or something that we really want to do, but we may feel coerced into doing it, so we consent anyway. So those are some important points to understand when we talk about whether a behavior is welcome or unwelcome. Now let's talk about some of these other words that were in that definition. What do they mean? Because these are the ors. The behavior could be demeaning or threatening or ridiculing. So, of course, demeaning means talking to someone in a way that lowers them in their status, character, or reputation. Because we are saying things that demean them, it makes them appear to others to be less than they are. Threatening is to make someone feel insecure or anxious. And so lots of times threatening behavior could be something that's verbal. It could be a verbal threat, or it could even be nonverbal. Sometimes it can be just the way we say something. I can say something like, "Dirty Harry, go ahead, make my day." And you may interpret that as a threat, especially if you're thinking about Dirty Harry. But I may be asking you to go ahead and do something great and make my day. So lots of times it's how we say it. Sometimes we think we can communicate things without actually stepping over the line. And we have to be really careful about that, because it doesn't necessarily mean that the communication, the threatening communication, is done verbally or even literally. That threatening communication can be communicated without it being literal or even verbal. So any kind of threatening behavior. Ridicule is to make fun of somebody or to mock them. Derision is the use of ridicule to show contempt for somebody. And coercion is to restrain or dominate by force, to compel someone to an act or choice. I like to say that we're all coerced every day, because most of us wouldn't even come to work if we didn't want a paycheck. That promise of a paycheck out there is a coercion. We come to work because we're coerced. But, what is the actual intent of the coercion? If we're coercing somebody into, an inappropriate relationship that is, meets these other criteria that we've talked about, then that could be a problem. Obviously, my paycheck isn't anything that's demeaning or threatening or ridicule. Well, it may be demeaning to me, but not necessarily. So we want to make sure that we are that this coercion is something that we avoid, especially when it comes to making people do something inappropriate that they wouldn't do otherwise if they weren't being coerced into it. Also, when we talk about harassment and discrimination, lots of times we talk about sexual harassment. When we go to a training, people will say, "Oh, I have to go to the sexual harassment class." Well, sexual harassment is just a smaller piece of the larger topic that we're addressing here. Sexual harassment is a form of gender discrimination. So sexual harassment is something that is directed at somebody because of the fact that they are male or female. And it really doesn't matter whether it's male or female that is directing that unwelcome behavior at the person. It could be male on male harassment. It can be male on female or female on male. It doesn't really matter. But sexual harassment is a gender-based discrimination. Also, when we talk about harassment, and specifically sexual harassment, but it could be other forms of harassment as well, there are different types that can exist. You can have the quid pro quo harassment, or you can have what we call the hostile work environment. Quid pro quo usually exists in a situation where we have someone in a position of authority who has the ability to coerce somebody into doing something that they don't want to do. Quid pro quo means literally something for something. You do something for me and I'll do something for you. You scratch my back, I'll scratch your back. And so generally we have someone in a position of authority who can make a promise or a threat to get someone to engage in, for example, sexual behavior with them in a way that it's not really welcome, but they're being coerced into it with a promise. You do something for me, I do something for you. That's quid pro quo. And that is something that we used to think of as being the sexual harassment. And when we thought about sexual harassment, we thought about that boss coercing his secretary into an inappropriate behavior, for example. But actually, with the hostile work environment, we actually find a situation where this harassment in the workplace can exist in a much broader way. So here, when we're talking about hostile work environment, we're talking about conduct directed towards a group or an individual, which is, a protected identification, one of these protected groups that we've talked about. So this protected group-based conduct, which unreasonably interferes with an individual's job performance or creates an intimidating, hostile, or offensive work atmosphere, whether or not the harassment is linked to any economic job consequences. So what this tells us, it doesn't have to be the boss who has the ability to coerce us through threats or promises. The hostile work environment can be created by anybody in the workplace. They don't have to have power over you to create this hostile work environment. You just have a coworker who's telling dirty jokes or saying or doing inappropriate things or making inappropriate advances towards, people in the workplace. That's not necessarily quid pro quo, but it can result in this hostile work environment. This hostile work environment can also, if we break it down, exist in several other forms. It can result from stereotyping, from protected group focus, in other words, focusing negative attention towards an entire group of people that's a protected group. It could be individual focused, or it could also result in inappropriate workplace touching, physical contact. So first of all, stereotyping is important to understand. Stereotyping is when we make a judgment about a person because of their membership in a specific group. So if I'm taking someone who is of a certain national origin or a certain gender, and I am deciding or making a decision about them because of my opinion of that gender or that national origin or whatever have you, I'm stereotyping that person. So if my behavior meets the definition of a hostile work environment by stereotyping people because I have a negative opinion or for some reason I treat people in this group in a different way, then that can be a hostile work environment. I could also be directing attention towards an entire group. Let's say I tell a joke and I'm making fun of people of a certain ethnic origin. That joke isn't directed at a specific person who's a member of that ethnic group, but I am behaving in a way towards a protected group in a way that could be offensive. And so we have to be careful about how we talk, not just towards or about individuals, but how we talk about groups in a protected class as well. Individual focus is where I am directing that attention at an individual. Maybe it could be someone I work with that I'm attracted to and I want them to go out on a date with me. And so I keep asking them out and they keep turning me down, and I keep asking them out and they keep turning me down. So we have an unwelcome, pervasive behavior that's directed at an individual. That could be uncomfortable for them. That could make it difficult for them to feel comfortable in their workplace and reasonably do their job. Then we could have a hostile work environment. Also, we have to be careful about touching. And touching is kind of a difficult topic because some people are okay with touching. We have people who are huggers and they want to hug everybody and they're perfectly fine with it and it doesn't bother them. Other people become very uncomfortable just because that physical contact is happening, even whether or not they're personally involved in it. So we need to be careful about that inappropriate or non-professional physical contact in the workplace, because physical contact does send a message. It communicates something to people. However, what it communicates may be interpreted different by different people, and that's something we have to be understanding of. So in the workplace, we need to be careful to limit physical contact to that which is appropriate for the profession or the job that's being done. Some people have jobs where we do have to touch people. Other people, appropriate touch in the workplace may be shaking hands. And so we need to make sure that the physical contact is necessary or normal for, the job that we're performing. So how do we address this reasonably? It's important to understand, if you are a supervisor, you have a responsibility to make sure that this kind of conduct is not going on in your work environment with your employees. And so we need to be aware of conduct and behavior. If someone says something to us, we need to make sure that we don't just brush it off, but that we take it seriously. We need to make sure that we communicate. So whether I'm a supervisor or if I'm just someone in a work environment who feels uncomfortable because of things that are being said or behaviors in the workplace, I need to say something to somebody. It's pretty hard to fix a problem if we don't communicate the problem. So you need to be able to communicate with at least your supervisor or the person who is identified in your policies and procedures for talking to if you have a complaint about potential harassment or discrimination or hostile work environment. So we got to be willing to communicate, report it to somebody so we can do something about it. And it needs to be documented. Lots of times we tend to hang back a little bit and just want to say, hey, we'll be kind of general because I don't want to get any particular one person in trouble. We got to make sure that we communicate specifics to our supervisors or those people in authority about what's happened, who's involved, when did it happen, where did it happen, so that we can go in and correct the behavior. And that's the whole goal. The goal isn't to identify people and make them a target and get rid of them per se. The goal is to correct the situation so that we don't have a hostile work environment. Who can be a victim of harassment and discrimination? Well, it can be that individual that I'm bugging to get them to go out with me or something like that. It can be that individual target. It can be anyone in the environment, someone who's subject to the environment. So we've got a couple of people and they're hanging out around the water cooler and they have inappropriate topic of conversation, whether that's storytelling or jokes they're sharing that aren't appropriate for the workplace. These two people may be perfectly fine with the conversation and it's welcome, and so they're okay with it. But if somebody else can overhear it, that's the environment. And so somebody else in the workplace subject to the environment can be a victim, whether or not they're an intended participant in the conversation. And so we have to be careful about people who may overhear things that we're saying, or people who may see things that we have on our computer or hanging on the walls of our office. Whether or not they're there for that person's benefit or not, they can affect other people in the work environment. And so we have to remember that others, are potentially victims, even if you don't see them as being exposed to the behavior in question. Those who try to help can also be victims. And so we call this retaliation. You can have illegal retaliation. So examples of retaliation would be, getting your pound of flesh, getting an eye for an eye, fighting fire with fire. You're going to fix someone's wagon, man. Someone, they stepped on my feet. They went and complained to the boss, went over my head. I'm going to fix their wagon. I'm going to give them a taste of their own medicine. Maybe I'll think of some complaints to go, tell about them, maybe whether they're true or not. Retaliation is any negative change in status, treatment, conditions, or benefits directed at an employee because of their involvement in any way regarding any complaint. So if somebody feels it's necessary to communicate a complaint to the manager, then they have a right to do that. Whether they're standing up to protect somebody else or whether they're offended themselves and they have a complaint. We can't treat this person different in a negative way because they are exercising their right to make a complaint. And we have to be very careful about that. Now, we can treat them different. It's okay to treat people better. And I've been in situations where someone's made a complaint in the workplace and I thought, ooh, could I be guilty of that? Could I be contributing to this person's complaint? And so I change my behaviors so that I make sure I'm not interacting with this person in a way that may be offensive to them. And that's okay. But if you treat someone different, if you give them a bad schedule, if you give them undesirable work assignments because you're upset with them for making a complaint, those are examples of retaliation. Worse examples of retaliation, of course, could be, demoting or firing somebody because you weren't happy about them making a complaint. We can't do that. That would be illegal retaliation. So what do you do if you think you've been illegally harassed or you witnessed illegal harassment or discrimination in the workplace? First thing, and the most important thing, is to make sure that you're familiar with your employer's policies and procedures. In your policy and procedure manual, it will spell out, how we deal with these complaints in the workplace, how we define them, and how and to whom you should be making your complaints, and in what form those complaints need to be submitted. So make sure you're familiar with your policies and procedures regarding harassment and discrimination. Make sure you know the appropriate person to talk to if you're having a problem. Now, this person that you need to talk to has to treat this information as confidential, and you need to have confidence that that person will treat the information confidentially, that it will be handled on a need-to-know basis. We need to make sure that we do this because, of course, like we said, the idea is to correct the situation. And so the person who's responsible for handling this complaint and their supervisors and managers possibly may need to be involved to determine what happened. Is the behavior actually harassing or discriminatory behavior? By applying what we call the reasonable person standard. And if they determine that there is a problem, then they talk to who needs to be talked to correct that situation or take whatever action needs to be taken to correct that situation. So have confidence that that will be handled appropriately with confidentiality. Also, report, like we said, to the appropriate authority and be prepared to give specific information. We can't just say, hey, boss, Joe, I want you to know that, there's probably some funny stuff going on third shift. You really need to pay attention to what's going on. We need to say, hey, boss, Joe, I witnessed something in the break room last night, on third shift between Jack and Joe or somebody else. And, this information is something that they need to be able to identify if there's a problem and what corrective action needs to be taken. So specific information, who, what, when, where, so that we can, get in and make those determinations and take that corrective action. If we need to do something to cooperate, to resolve the problem, we need to do that. And even if you're not the person making the complaint, if someone just comes to you with some questions about something that may have happened, we all need to make sure that we cooperate with these efforts to determine what happened and to correct the problem, because that's really for all of our benefit, that we have a non-hostile work environment, a place that's friendly for us to be able to work and get our jobs done. And harassment and discrimination in the workplace don't just hurt one person or the members of the protected class. It really hurts everybody when people can't do their job as well as they should because of these adverse conditions. So in review, let's just look at a few questions here and see if we can determine, from what we talked about so far, what is or isn't harassment or discrimination in the workplace in an illegal way. Number one, sexual harassment is a type of gender discrimination. True or false? And that is absolutely true. Sexual harassment is a type of gender discrimination. So it is a piece of a larger picture when we talk about potential harassment and discrimination. To be considered sexual harassment, conduct must be unwelcome. And that's true, but we have to make sure we understand what that means. We can have a behavior that's unwelcome even in the absence of somebody complaining about it. If a behavior is unwelcome to me, it's unwelcome to me whether I say something or not. But yes, it must be unwelcome behavior. Harassment can't exist if there is consent. Is that true? Well, no, that's not true at all. We can have consent, especially when there's coercion taking place. That doesn't mean that that behavior or that activity was welcome just because we consented to it. A history of rejected advances must exist for a claim to be valid. And that's not necessarily true either. Okay, we can have a complaint, whether someone has actually turned us down in our advances, to get that person to go out with us or whatever. They don't actually have to have that history of, record of it being a rejection. That again, whether it's unwelcome, may be something that may not have been communicated clearly. That doesn't make the behavior okay. Sexual harassment only exists if there is a request for sex. Absolutely. Does sexual behavior have something to do with sexual harassment? Yes, oftentimes it does. But remember, sexual harassment doesn't just involve sexual conduct. Sexual harassment is gender-based discrimination. Okay, so it has to do with activities directed towards a person or communications directed towards a person because of their gender. And so it's actually a much broader subject than just sexual activity. Deeply held religious beliefs gives an employee special protection? No, we all have a creed. A creed is a belief system. So whether you are a religious person or not, we still respect each other's beliefs and their belief system. And so someone with very strictly held religious beliefs where they do have protection, it doesn't mean they have any protection that anybody else doesn't also have. We all have that same protection. Not reporting harassment means the behavior is welcome, and again, that's not true. If someone's failure to communicate their displeasure with behavior going on in the workplace doesn't mean that it's okay, and we need to recognize what is or isn't appropriate in the workplace. To determine if conduct is severe or pervasive, the reasonable person standard is applied to the totality of circumstances, and that's true. And what that means is when your boss is investigating a complaint, they need to look at everything that contributes to the situation in making that determination, whether this is reasonably, can be considered harassment or discrimination. And so often you've heard the saying, there's two sides to every story. Well, your boss needs to look at, two sides or three sides or four sides. We have to look at the totality of the circumstances when we make this determination, whether we have a violation of our harassment and discrimination policy. The fact that an employee also told dirty jokes is inconsequential for determining if they were harassed as a result of the boss telling dirty jokes. And that's true. It doesn't quite seem fair or right, you might think, but just because I told a dirty joke to somebody doesn't mean that I may not still be offended if somebody else tells a dirty joke. So again, that doesn't mean it's welcome. Just because I participated in similar behavior myself doesn't automatically mean that I'm welcome to all such behavior, and we need to make sure we're behaving appropriately in the workplace. An employee can't bring a claim when they also participated in the offensive behavior, kind of the same thing, and that's true. You can still bring a claim regardless of whether you participated in the behavior or not. So when we talk about this, we want to make sure that we're not being the person who is being offensive. And that's probably one of the big reasons why we have this training. We want to make sure that you understand what this topic means and how your conduct influences others in the workplace. Some common mistakes that we might make include sharing too much personal information on the workplace, telling everybody at work Monday morning about all the details of your crazy and wild weekend may not be necessarily appropriate for the workplace. Focus on or comments about others' bodies. Absolutely, we want to make sure that we avoid, focusing on, leering, staring at, or talking about somebody's body. That can definitely be a situation that causes people to feel uncomfortable and can result in a hostile work environment. Don't keep or share graphic material, whether that's via emails or things that you post on social media that coworkers may have access to, whether it's things you send in a text message, pictures, calendars that you hang on the wall of your shop, desktop images that are on your computer. We can have all sorts of ways that inappropriate material can be brought into the workplace, and we need to make sure that we're not doing that. Don't convey inappropriate messages through email, texting, notes, or pictures. Do be the one. We want to make sure that we set a good example. Our behavior should be a standard for others, hopefully, to follow. Dress professionally. Keep your hands to yourself. Make sure if you see a potential problem, or if you're experiencing a problem that with harassment or discrimination, that you communicate, that you say something to someone. It's okay to address the person who's offending you, and that is definitely often a positive way of helping to solve a problem. But also, if you want it addressed, you definitely need to make sure you address it to your supervisor or the person identified in your policy and procedure manual as being the person to bring these complaints to. Make sure you say something if you witness harassment or discrimination occurring, because like we said, it hurts everybody. If I have a coworker who's not functioning well because they're experiencing a hostile work environment, my interaction with them is going to be affected. Their productivity is going to be affected. That's going to have effects on me and everybody else. And so we need to respect each other and make sure that we are working together to keep our workplaces free of offensive harassment and illegal discrimination. So as I mentioned at the beginning, there will be a test that you need to take. There'll be a few questions that we will present to you now, and you'll need to answer these questions to confirm that you have completed and understood this training. We appreciate your attendance and your attention. Good luck. Thank you very much.